It is the 8th day of Drizztmas, though really it is the 10th. Time has lost all meaning. For uncounted hours, I have dragged my mind through the underdark of R.A. Salvatore's writing, a place inimical to creativity, a place inimical to the imagination or even entertainment. In vain I had hoped for plots worth following. In vain I had hoped for characters worth getting into. My hope has slowly dwindled away and died. The future has turned into an endless, starless night. So it's time to get some light in here and have a beer. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to the 8th day of Drizztmas, published on the 10th because, as I said, things are slow, and today we'll be talking about Starless Night by R.A. Salvatore, Book 2 of the Legacy of the Drow subseries in the larger ongoing series of Drizztmas novels published by R.A. Salvatore. We'll do the usual thing. I'll be give you a quick summary of what's going on in the book, and then we'll talk about what it does towards D&D fiction. We talk about all the stuff that's wrong. And today, because there's not that much going on that is new with this one, I'll try to also give a bit of a larger context on what I am currently seeing in this, as we have slowly past the, midpoint of this incredible exercise. So, let's get started, shall we? Alright. So, Starless Night moves on from what happened during the Legacy and follows a lot of characters doing basically nothing much. So first of all, there is Drizztmas, who, for some reason, decides to go into the Underdark, to Menzoberranzan, to do something that is not fully explained and never really made clear even to himself, to stop all the Drow coming for his friends in Mithril Hall. Now, to be clear, it was revealed near the end of during the Legacy, that matron, mother, Bayenry, whatever her actual first name is, we don't know, owns, the ghost, or the tooth of the ghost of Bruner's ancestor, and wants to take over Mithril Hall for the Drow. So there is that actual threat. Drizzt surmises there might be a threat, thinks it's all about him, and decides to go back into the Underdark to do something. And as I said, it's never fully made clear what he wants to do to stop 20,000 Drow from attacking Mithril Hall. Guess he's just that powerful, or thinks he's that powerful. And the sad part is, of course, that you can't be sure he isn't looking at these books. Alright, so there's that. Next, then, Catti decides to follow Drizzt to save him for reasons that are probably going to be explored in the future. And then, the rest of the gang, these being Regis and Brunner, because, Wolfgar is dead, supposedly, hang out in Mithril Hall. What happens there is Brunner is taken over by grief, the loss of his eye, and other things, and Regis takes over the defense of Mithril Hall to build that up against a coming attack of a bunch of Drow. And from then on, we usually just follow Drizzt and Catti down into the Underdark, where they meet up with Jalaxley and Entreri, who has, of course, survived again. And then there's a shit ton of fighting. Drizzt gets, captured by first Jalaxley and his gang, and then given to House by Henry. Then Entreri and Catti have to unite to free him, to make their way back to the overworld, because even Entreri has figured out that the Underdark sucks. Which it does. And then there's even more fighting, and they come back up, and, Drizzt and Catti go back to Mithril Hall, and Entreri goes somewhere to return in the future, possibly in the Sellsword trilogy, which I have not read, possibly before then, because of course he has to. That's the plot. It's even less plot than usual, and even more combat than usual. So, yeah. It's why I'm struggling even harder than usual, because there's nothing going on in this book that is not just someone wandering around in Menzoberranzan and having a bunch of fights and, a bunch of callbacks to older books, because of course we have to meet Belvar Disengulp for a second, and even the other kind of Swerfnebly that befriended Drizzt. I keep forgetting his name because he's really not important. And so we see all of that, and that's that. So let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and let's talk about what this book brings to the table and what it maybe doesn't bring to the table. Remember how last time we talked about the class of the cleric getting a bit of an introduction? Well, this time around, there's no new classes getting exposition. This book is all about magical items and how they're oh so fucking awesome. Now, this is obviously something that has been around for these books from the beginning, because the lack of actual spellcasters within these books, or within the main crew of heroes, means that whenever they have to do something that requires magical items, they do, of course, well, that requires magic, they need to use magical items. See the ruby pendant that Regis uses, which casts the spell charm, because there's no cleric who can use charm in their group, or, well, not cleric, but wizard. Look, for example, at, well, the different weapons that everyone is using. Wolfgar's hammer, Aegis Fang, which is basically Mjolnir and coming back again and again, or Cadibray's machine gun bow, Talmaril, or whatever it's called, the Heartseeker, which has 20 arrows that get replenished magically all the time, so she can just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot, and it probably also gives you a way higher attack bonus, so she can, basically use it like a machine gun, which is exactly how she uses it here. And Drizzt, of course, having two magical scimitars. One called Twinkle, which I don't know what it does except, producing blue light, but having swords that produce light is kind of an important bit in these books. We'll come back to that with Artemis and Treri. And of course, the other one that still hasn't gotten a name, but he stole from, or took from, the layer of icing death in the beginning of the Crystal Shard, which does grant immunity from fire. And then there's obviously the mask that Drizzt and then now Cadibray, and in the middle, Artemis and Treri use, which allows you to change your shape. There's Guinevere, which produces, well, is a statue that produces or helps to summon a panther from the astral plane, and there's way more of these things. Interestingly enough, for this part of the series, the Legacy of the Drow series, Artemis and Treri got buffed up as well. See, in the last book, we didn't talk about it back then, I'll bring it up today, he had a bunch of new magical items. So what we learned is that the dagger he used before is now a magical dagger that allows him to, well, absorb life force, heal his wounds by taking the life force from whomsoever he's stabbing with that dagger. And obviously the dagger belongs to Regis and then to Cadibray and so forth. It's a dagger that goes around a while. And of course, and Treri's sword, which he had used before, is now constantly glowing green, which I guess means that we have like a green versus blue lightsaber kind of duel whenever Drizzt and Treri are fighting. It's just interesting that the sword glowing has not been mentioned before, for example, in the Halfling's Gem, when they have a duel down in the sewers, which are dark. So, there's a shitload of magical items. Another one is, of course, the bracers, the arm bracers that Drizzt takes from Bayenri's Weapon Master at the end, which probably cast the spell haste, or at least speed up the wearer. There's a magical spider mask that allows you to cross the magical fence. There's a lot of magical items in this book. And this makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways, because Dungeons & Dragons has always been about treasure. When it comes to new monsters, we only get one more. That is, of course, the Displacer Beast, which is arguably a really cool one. Just say, it's a six-legged panther that has tentacles as a bonus, and Drizzt kills it, and that's that. But, we take what we can get. There's also an item, a tiger's eye, I guess it's called. It's a enchanted agate that Cadibray gets given by Elastriel and allows her to see in the dark, because of course she doesn't have infravision and so forth. Lots of magical items into this one, because the recovering of treasure has always been intrinsic in the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing games. On the one hand, taking gold or other stuff was equivalent to gaining experience in very early editions of the game, where you could exchange gold for, you got experience points for having amassed a lot of treasure. That has slowly changed over time, but gold is still one way of keeping score. And magical items are, of course, a way to buff your party to fight bigger monsters. Because the problem is, of course, unlike, say, the skirmish-based ideas of wargaming, where a lot of the fun or enjoyment comes from taking the same kind of groups of forces and refighting the same kind of battles again and again to work out on tactics and so forth. With Dungeons and Dragons or any other tabletop role playing game, and the campaign idea of having characters do more and more stuff in an ongoing story, or well, what we call a campaign, what happens here is, of course, you need to have some form of progress, which I guess is something that y'all already know from from lit RPGs and progression fantasies, which I have not read. But this is sort of taking the next step from what we're talking about here. So progression is necessary. And you get progression by beefing up and bumping up the monsters that people get to fight. Now, your average orc has a certain limit of what he can do, or what they can do. So you invent more and more powerful magical monsters. When you look back at Dungeons and Dragons, it did have, well, it did have like all kinds of stats for even the gods themselves. So you could kill gods. And one of the things we learn as dungeon masters and players, like if anything has hit points, players or player characters will kill it. It's just built in. So, but to make that possible, there's all kinds of ways you can do that. And one of them is give people cool treasures. Once again, this has, of course, been, built into the fantasy literature genre as well, having invisible rings, as we know from mythology and legend. There's the cap that gives invisibility in Greek mythology. Apparently, it's made from dog fur. Is it Theseus? No, it's not Theseus. It's Perseus who gets that one. There's all kinds of magical items have had a long tradition in fairy tales, in legends, and in mythology. So putting them into this game makes a lot of sense. Giving them specific functionality for the players to become even more powerful killing machines also makes sense. So it also, it kind of fits that this book is very much about our characters, our heroes, gaining all kinds of magical goo that they can use to blow up shit, which is exactly what they do all the time. So that's most of what we see when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons and Forgotten Realms in that regard. Recreation, sort of. Now, what else is in here? And I think there's another thing that is a bit of a departure for the overarching series, although we already saw parts of that happening with the Dark Elf trilogy. See, the Icewind Dale trilogy, the first one in publication order, was, of course, very close to actual adventure modules or campaigns. You had stuff that you could basically take and run on your own gaming table. In that regard, they were very close and worked very well as a tie-in product or advertisement for Dungeons and Dragons as a game. Now, with the Dark Elf trilogy, that changed because it basically the backstory of one character, that being Drizztmas, who is slowly made the poster child for the entire thing. Now, that of course means a change in pace. While there were, of course, game books where you could play an adventure on your own, these are few and far between nowadays. I think the Tunnels of Trolls guys are still publishing some of them, solo adventures as they call them, and that's cool. But it leads to a different type of storytelling. Now, with the Legacy of the Drow, we have, in theory at least, the party back together. The band is back together. So you could move back to a kind of telling or retelling of actual, or something that feels close to actual Dungeons and Dragons adventures. Role-playing game adventures in general. Salvatore, however, does not choose to do so, but wants to actually tell something closer to your average non-role-playing game tie-in fantasy adventure. So we have most of our characters doing stuff on their own. We also get a lot more switches of actual character viewpoints. For the first time, we get Cannibree's point of view, at least. In, a significant part of the story is written in Cannibree's point of view. We get some Artemis Entreri in there. We get some Drizzt, of course. We get some Brunner Battlehammer. We get some Regis. We get, like, everyone. Possibly even a little bit of Jarlaxle. So we're moving closer to a model of telling fantasy stories that became, more popular in the 1990s, and this was written in 1992, 1993. So we're entering the mid-90s, where having multi-point of view kind of fantasy had already become a thing. This is, past the first one, two, three books of Wheel of Time, for example. This is slowly, right around the time that A Game of Thrones is published, right around the time, well, a lot of these types of fantasy books with multiple different point of view characters become more popular. And clearly Salvatore is trying to do the same thing, or is trying to sort of walk that tightrope between this being a Dungeons and Dragons tie-in adventure, and on the other hand also trying to write this like a regular fantasy novel. Whether that is because there's always been a bit of odium attached to just role-playing game tie-in novels. I'll not argue whether that was justified or not. I'll just mention that it was, and he wants to, wanted to be seen as one of the big boys writing actual fantasy and not just Dungeons and Dragons products. I don't know. Maybe it's just that the overall tone of the field had shifted towards this type of storytelling. The problem is, however, it does not necessarily work, and the question is whether that is because there were too many restrictions from TSR at the time put upon Salvatore, or whether he's just not yet skilled enough to do it justice, to change his, perspective, his writing style and his tone enough. Because remember, when we talked about it very early on, most of these characters have just one specific facet to their character. Brunner is angry with a heart of gold. Regis wants to live comfortably. Wolfgar wants to be an honorable barbarian. Catti has to be a girl, I guess. She doesn't have much of a character in the early novels anyway, so there's definitely some room for Salvatore to improve himself, although so far he's not doing much of it. And Drizzt is stoic. But with Drizzt, we get a bit more, his inner struggles, while poorly executed, are still there, of him trying to figure out who to be, how to be honorable, how to be, not a murder machine, and so forth. We see a bit more of that. The problem is, once you have a lot of, internal monologues and have a lot of what you might call different point of views with like the inner world of these characters, you need to add more to that, because otherwise, yeah, just seeing Brunner being angry from the outside kind of makes sense. You can say he has a gruff exterior. Now we're supposed to also get his thoughts. Same for Regis, same for Catti, and for a lot of these characters, there's just nothing there, and that's a bit of a problem. So I see these books, especially this 4-part series, subseries, The Legacy of the Drow, as a bit of a transition period within the larger Drizzt universe, where Salvatore is trying to figure out where to actually go with this. Make it more retellings of D&D adventures, make it something more akin to actual epic fantasy. He's fucking around with it, and so far he has not found out what to actually do. So that's the first part. Now let's talk about some other issues here. Because there's more inconsistencies, a lot of them that feel like editing problems. Like minor ones where the serpent head whips from previous books are now called tentacle rods, which sounds way more sexual than it should. But there we go. Another bit that I found fascinating in how out of place it was is, in this book we have Catti coming to Silverymoon and running into Elastriel, and the whole thing feels like a set piece. She comes there, she feels dirty, she feels human, versus, the oh so beautiful Elastriel, elf, mage, whatever. So it's a set piece we've seen in a lot of stories before, where the soon-to-be true love interest of our main character has that feeling of inferiority towards someone she usually thinks of as a rival or potential rival in a lot of ways. The problem, however, is that Elastriel and Catti had met before, and we have more than one scene where they even talk to each other, right? That is when Elastriel brings in Brunner Battlehammer after him surviving Mithril Hall in the Halfling's Gem. It is when Brunner and Catti then fly away to save Drizzt in the Halfling's Gem. They have met before. which makes no sense. Which is why it makes no sense that Illustrial in this book says like, "I was wondering when we would finally meet Catty I'm like, you have. Now I can see how like a centuries old elf may, have issues with memory, but Canterbury's like 21 now, and this is like supposedly 2 years ago. She should probably remember someone who can give her flying chariots, right? And I just feel there's a lost chance there because you could still build up that idea of jealousy and inferiority in Canterbury figuring out that she is in fact actually really cool. You could build up all of that without doing these like dumb things about like, oh, they meet for the first time bit. You don't need that. So I'm just curious why it is in there. It just feels that a lot of these books, especially now, have been put together with some lack of care, possibly, because these feel like things that you should notice and be aware of. All right, so let's move into the rest of this before I talk a bit about my current state of mind about all of Drizztmas. As I said, most of what follows after that is just combat and builds more into that idea of progression fantasy and lit RPG, because a lot of this is about people wanting to find out how good they are versus when they are supposed to fight Drizzt. There's like Berginion Bayenri, whom he met, was one in his class in Homeland, and then there's his older brother who wants to sort of prove that he's better than Zagnafane, who's of course dead, so he has to kill Drizzt. Everyone just wants to fight Drizzt to find out how good they are, and everyone loses, which is boring as fuck. But it's sort of built into this story and makes for so much repetition. Basically from part 3 onwards, and once again, this book has like 5 parts, like all the others as well. But from part 3 onwards, when everyone is sort of around Menzoberranzan, all we get are fight scenes in different, more or less exotic locales. And that's that. Yes, this time around, there's like 3-dimensional combat because people are climbing up the different stalactites and stalagmites and running around on bridges and jumping up and down and levitating. And I guess that's exciting in a way. But it's similar to something that we see in a lot of Wheel of Time when Brandon Sanderson takes over. Adding a third dimension to combat does not necessarily help when all you have is combat. And that's exactly what makes this book in particular, Starless Night, so incredibly hard to get through for me. Because, yeah, people are just fighting. And Treyri finds out that he really doesn't like Jaws, so he wants to get back to the surface. Drizzt is the only one who can help him, so they have to fight together to get out of there. We get a bit of that whole, like, nemesis, maybe best friends kind of vibe there. It could totally turn into something really cool with a added homoeroticism, but it doesn't, because, of course, Drizzt will have to get with Canterbury, and there's love and no eroticism in these books, which is a bit of a shame, I'll just say. But beyond that, we just learn a few more drow fights, fighting techniques, a few more, spells, magic items, people riding cool lizards on the ceiling, which, yeah. But at this point, I had already read The Color of Magic, where people are hanging upside down and fighting upside down in a cave during, the dragon part there, which is incidentally very much a parody of a lot of like 80s and 70s fantasy, so it does kind of fit very well into this. And then, yeah, big explosions, nothing more. And yeah, I know that the upcoming books will be really bad, have some terrible plot lines, but at least they're doing something more than just constant fighting in the Underdark. Even the idea of having Drizzt return to his past and having to face up to stuff he was in the past kind of feels weird at this point, because it's not that long ago, right? And it was never built up that well. Possibly that's a problem of, the Dark Elf trilogy being released after the Icewind Dale trilogy, but the whole Drizzt having to return down to the Underdark again feels like, oh god, I was glad we got rid of that whole part, because it's not that interesting in the long run. So it just fails to engage in a lot of ways. And I'm scared of the next two, which will be a Siege of Darkness and a Passage to Dawn, because I know that they'll still deal with like Drow stuff, and it's annoying and it's boring, and Drow don't make for good enemies. But that brings me to the final part of today's video, which is mostly me complaining, because, as I said, this is probably the one with the least interesting plot so far. And that is a general question on how these work as fiction for Dungeons and Dragons, what they do in fact report, and or how they fit into that, and a first stab at why these may be so popular, or may have been so popular. So, there's like several layers to all of this. See, Dungeons and Dragons as a rule set started without campaign settings. We talked about that. Campaign settings, like the Forgotten Realms, then added a world which had to comply, or sort of comply, to the rules. One important rule here is, of course, alignment, which does not actually make for good gameplay, but was included in early versions of the game, possibly taken from the Eternal Champion stories by Michael Moorcock, possibly from something else, possibly just as a way to determine which figures on a battle map are allowed to be killed without consequence, and which ones will follow, where consequence will follow when you kill them. However, it then got applied to entire species, which is why we have that whole evil races, the war of evil races against good races that Salvatore talks about in Sojourn, and comes back to it again and again, which is obviously highly problematic. Keep in mind, this is the 1980s and early 1990s. So we have these aspects, and Salvatore has to sort of fit into that at the time. But beyond the rules as written in the books, there's a second layer of rules here. And those of you who have ever played any form of tabletop role-playing game know about that. It's like, there's two things there. There's house rules, which are rules you come up with at your own gaming table to fix some very specific problem to your specific group, or make something work better for you. And then there's general gaming culture. And this, I think, is the key point. See, there are bits and pieces in here that are just in there because, of the idiosyncrasies of the original designers like Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and so forth. And they, over time, and of course, combined with all kinds of other factors like, buying power and so forth, led to a very specific audience for Dungeons and Dragons, which is privileged, white, middle class, mostly male, at the time, in the 1980s. This is not where Dungeons and Dragons is today, and there's an ongoing thing going, struggle about that, about the idea of what Dungeons and Dragons can be and so forth. But this is where it starts out in the 80s. So we start from that, a game that is played by these specific people in that specific situation. And that leads and changes the tone of the game, or cements the tone of the game in a very specific way. It becomes a story or a community with culture around it that is very, teenage, very male, very white, and somewhat middle class for most of it. And that comes with, all kinds of cultural practices. And it's that sort of the praxis that I think is constantly in tension with the rules as written. And between those two is where we get the Salvatore novels. And I think that they lean closer to that unwritten praxis. Why do I think that? See, I've played games. I've played tabletop role-playing games for a long time. And a lot of the stuff we did at the gaming table, I did at the gaming table, either as a player or as a game master, as a teenager, were really bad. And this is, me coming back to this. I'm not so much cringing at that I enjoyed some of these Drizzt novels as a kid. I'm cringing at all the stuff we did at the gaming table. We were racist as fuck at the gaming table, not necessarily knowing that we were, because as a 14-year-old boy, you're not aware of how painful it is to, give all the orcs really terrible accents and stuff. You don't necessarily are aware of the larger implications. So we were cruel. We reveled in, having incredibly vile displays of cruelty and violence there. And it's like, let's something like, say, that huge ram the dwarves built in the Legacy to just like squash a ton of goblins and making fun about squashing goblins. That's something that very well could have happened at our table at the time. Because, teenagers are pretty callous. Teenagers have no concept of the consequences of violence, so they enjoy that. We enjoyed that as kids. And we were, because of where I grew up, very insensitive to questions of marginalization when it comes to race, ethnicity, religion, and gender, because I usually mostly played with other boys at the time. So a lot of that stuff I find in these books, and that I find terrible in these books, is stuff that I remember, vaguely remember, because, you know, I don't have that many big memories of all these games because a lot of them were not really that good, probably. I see there as well. And this is, I think, the core of what makes Drizzt so powerful and so successful. At the time, these books adhered much closer to the cultural practice of playing Dungeons and Dragons, the way Dungeons and Dragons felt to the group to the audience that it had slowly built over the first 15 to 20 years of its existence, with all its problems and its cruelty. So people enjoyed it back then. You add to that very specific aspects of the character of Drizzt that we'll talk about in a different video, and you understand, and it's very easy to explain why these books became so successful. But why did they stay so successful? That, I think, is the other part. Because Dungeons and Dragons has moved on. For all kinds of reasons, mostly probably because Hasbro and Wizard of the Coast really wanted to extend and expand its audience, Dungeons and Dragons has become more nuanced. We have stopped talking about all orcs being evil. We have, and there's, tons of factors, Warcraft being a big one, right? Suddenly people really enjoyed having orcs, and people were trying to play the same thing in Dungeons and Dragons. And so alignment and the idea of having an entire group being all evil sort of went away, or it was slowly moved into the background, and the idea of races and racial bonuses and stuff like that has been moved away over time. Then, with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and the rise of streaming and online entertainment, it has become more inclusive and its playstyle has changed. People are way more about theater. People are way more inclusive of different identities, marginalized identities in particular. The split between Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder around Paizo and Wizards has obviously had an impact there as well, with Paizo being a more progressive company in a lot of ways. So Dungeons and Dragons has changed, and you just need to go online to see a lot of old white men whining about how it is no longer what it used to be, how it has changed and has gone woke and bad and all of that stuff. And that audience, that slowly is dying out, I hope. The old white men audience that used to be white middle-class teenagers playing this. These people, they can go and still read Drizzt Do'Urden and find themselves in there, because it is still like they remember it being back in the day. And this, I think, is why there is a continued popularity for these Drizzt novels, for these older Drizzt novels in particular. I have no idea how woke last year's Drizzt novel was, but I think this is sort of what I've come to realize over these books. I personally really don't like reading these books. It's painful because they show me what a terrible person I was when I was 14. Now, once again, most of us are pretty terrible when we are 14, but I have to come to terms with the fact how incredibly insensitive in a lot of ways I was back then. I'm constantly trying to do better. I'm constantly failing, of course, in all kinds of ways. It's part of growing up and being alive. But reading these books makes me have to come back to that. It's almost as if I am Drizzt, and I'm looking into the mirror, and Artemis and Trary is staring back at me. At least, if they were written by a competent writer. And reading these books and enjoying them would mean that I hadn't grown. And there's a lot of people who really don't want to grow, because growing in that regard means losing part of your privilege. All these privileges of being white, middle class, male, heterosexual, and whatnot. And hating privileges sucks. So I get it why they're popular. I get it why people don't like that criticism. But it's still necessary. And that's why I will continue through the Starless Night and the Siege of Darkness, all the way to the Passage at Dawn and beyond into the Paths of Darkness, which I'm aware does not bode well. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll see you tomorrow when it's time for Siege of Darkness. And until then, thanks and cheers.